Now, how would you describe the state of modern feminism currently?
The state of it, well, it's pure insanity and total chaos, but unfortunately, it's extremely dominant. Feminism dominates the mainstream culture in the West now, and it has for a few decades. But I mean, the way that things are now, if you even kind of question any of the fundamental presuppositions of feminism or whether it was a good idea, you're immediately, attacked and lambasted and called all kinds of horrible names. So it's kind of become this religious thing where it's a sacred part of Western culture that you're not allowed to criticize.
That is always the most suspicious parts of Western culture, those that you're not allowed to criticize. They've been made that way as well. I find it so interesting. But how dangerous is it for children that modern feminism is in such a state?
Oh, I mean, it's any of the big problems and concerns that a lot of us would have about children and what's going on with them directly stem from feminist movements. So you could not have this transgender kids stuff that we've all been talking about for the last few years without feminism first. A lot of people probably don't understand that even early feminists like Margaret Fuller in the 1840s were talking about, switching genders, gender abolition, gender as a spectrum, gender as a social construct. So these ideas, they may seem new to a lot of us, but they're actually quite old, and they even come from, ancient religious traditions that were revived after the Enlightenment. So all of the, children growing up without fathers in the home, I think 41% of children in the United States now are born out of wedlock. In 1960, that number was only 5%. So that's a huge change in just 50, 60 years. That we went from this tiny minority of children being born to just single moms to now almost half of them being born to single mothers. And if you look at all of the risk factors for any adverse childhood experiences from, substance abuse, ADHD, homelessness, children who end up in juvenile facilities, or children who end up in psychiatric wards or on psych meds, the numbers are like 80-90% of them come from fatherless homes. We have just rampant divorce. A lot of people aren't even bothering to get married, don't even believe in that anymore. So, the primary reason I do what I do is because so many children are growing up like this, being raised in daycare centers and public schools with no family structure at home to support them whatsoever. So almost any problem that you would see with kids is going to stem directly from feminism.
Yeah, and a load of those kids are being raised just by YouTube and Disney and other things like this. They're being given a phone to keep themselves occupied because, and it's not this is course where we get to where we have to constantly say, oh, it's not the fault of the mother that they haven't got the time or they're busy all over the place, but that whole idea of a family unit, it was so good. It's so good for humans, and it's so sad that we've seen that diminish. Now, for many of my viewers and listeners, they'll know my work on the infamous Gloria Steinem and her decades-long relationship with the CIA. How do you see people like Gloria Steinem?
Well, I see them as this larger cultural engineering push. So people have this idea. If you were just to ask a man on the street, what do you think life was like for women before women's suffrage and before feminism? They'll have this vague idea that women were generally enslaved, they were oppressed, they had no rights, they could never leave their home, their husbands could legally abuse them in all sorts of ways. And then, suddenly one day, for seemingly no reason at all, suffragettes said, oh no, we're oppressed and we have to start marching until we have rights. And that, all the women who came before us fought for us to have these rights. And it was just this organic, natural response to the, soul crushing boot of the patriarchy being on women's necks throughout history. And it's really not how it happened at all. And Gloria Steinem is probably the poster child for this because she was recruited out of Smith College in the late 1950s by the CIA. Cord Meyer, I think, was the guy who recruited her, and they created a fake fellowship for her called the Chester Bowles Fellowship. a phony, like fake scholarship to kind of conceal the funding source of what they did with her next, which was send her to India for 2 years. Now, when I saw in my research that they sent her to India, I immediately thought about Theosophy, because predecessors in the feminist movement, like Helena Blavatsky, the creator of Theosophy, also a known intelligence asset, who I think did a lot of traveling to India, not just for spiritual purposes. I think it was more of a front for her intelligence work for a lot of British elites. I think they kind of did the same thing with Steinem, who, interestingly, her mother and grandmother were both Theosophists and raised her in that tradition. So I thought that was extremely interesting that that's the first place they sent her is India, and she goes there to work with Jean Joyce of the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation are the main creators of women's studies programs. So we can get into lots of details about how feminism was not this like natural grassroots thing that was demanded by women. It was completely engineered. It was totally astroturfed. And even if there were a small minority of women who truly believed in feminism, only about 4% of women who were polled at the time right before suffrage wanted anything to do with women's liberation or with women's suffrage at all. They were extremely against it. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony say in their own writings that the biggest obstacle to women's liberation was women themselves, because they felt very privileged. They felt like they had a lot of protections under male suffrage that they didn't want to lose. So that's kind of what, if anybody takes away anything from this, it should be that feminism was not women's response to oppression from men. It was a top-down social engineering movement that was pushed by elites who had a lot of control in media and other institutions.
Yeah, and he did use the cover when Gloria Steinem went to India that she was going to be filming some sort of documentary going around India, and then suddenly she's hanging around with Indira Gandhi, and she's hanging around with the wife of revolutionary N.N. Royf, I think his name is, and lots of other people. But there was also some really weird. I was really interested by her journey back to America in 1958, I believe it is, where she slips on this Japanese cruiser, and this rear admiral, who's one of the highest ranked people in the American Navy, is being homed, or however you say it, across to America from his base, where he was basically in charge of the entire fleet in Japan, in the waters of Japan, and he goes mysteriously disappears from the ships. And Gloria Steinem's the one who, actually young Steinem is the one who gives over he said goodbye to his wife, and then he left and he was never seen again. She gives the sort of like story to it and tells the story. I find that really interesting. Welcome back to the Johnny Vedmore Show on today's News Talk TNT. I'm here with Rachel Wilson, and we're talking about modern feminism. But I just want to talk about Steinem just a tiny little bit more. In relation to Steinem's effect on modern feminism, I see her as one of the most powerful feminist gatekeepers to emerge since World War II. Why are so many people still completely clueless about what someone like Steinem really represents?
Well, I think because there's a giant media apparatus of propaganda, the likes of which we've never seen, that has promoted her and others as freedom fighters, right? This altruistic cause that they just really care about women and women's rights. So, I mean, Steinem was part of this National Student Association, which was basically an intelligence front and part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA project, part of an even bigger project, which was called Operation Mockingbird. Probably some of your listeners know about that. The Congress for Cultural Freedom had over 400 journalists working for them in the 60s to promote liberalization of the West and liberalized values as part of the Cold War. It was like part of this Cold War initiative. So when you've got like major newspapers, magazines, and TV outlets, especially during this era when the boomer generation is young and there is no alternative media yet, there's they had almost nothing to combat this giant media apparatus of propaganda, which just beat into their heads that, women were these oppressed victims throughout history, and that this was necessary. It was akin to slavery. You always see, even since the Civil War, the feminist movement is always like trying to connect itself to slavery abolition and things like this. So then on top of that, right, you have the Ford Foundation creating the gender studies departments as a discipline, which it had never been before, and that happened in 1970. That's right when they start pushing women into university and saying, you can't be a stay-at-home mom. It's extremely risky. You can't depend on your husband to support the family because you're going to, they really convinced a generation of women that you'll be abused if you depend on your husband to support you and your children. So you've got to go to college. You have to. That's what the smart girls do. That's what the successful women do. So of course, they see women's studies, and a lot of them want to go into women's studies, which is only going to be run by women who have already bought into feminism. Nobody goes to be a feminist studies professor unless they're already convinced, right, and on board with feminism. So just this huge media brainwashing apparatus. And remember that the CIA at this time is also conducting MK Ultra studies, which is another giant operation to figure out how to control public opinion. It's basically mind control, right? So the reason people don't know or don't understand this is, first of all, they don't understand about cultural and social engineering. They don't understand that the CIA is not this like benevolent force just trying to protect the United States from foreign enemies. In fact, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a massive violation of the CIA charter, which says you're not supposed to be doing that sort of thing, like domestic spying and propaganda, but they were. So I think, so many people are just very unaware of this because of the giant propaganda machine that it created.
It's very interesting because the when you see I think it's in 1967 where Ramparts and other news organizations are revealing how the CIA have been funding all of these different operations, and Steinem first goes on TV, and at the end of that like TV spot where she admits that she was in the pay of the CIA, it's called In the Pay of the CIA, I think. Where at the end of that, she kind of describes the CIA, as the commentator described, as being like a kindly uncle or something along those lines, who is just out for your best interest. And that's really what they were trying to. And so the CIA have clearly done a number on feminism. So how hard is it to change the narrative now when it was seemingly set in stone an entire generation ago?
Well, it's really tough. I go on a lot of these like big podcasts where they're talking about dating and relationships between men and women and how awful it is, how this younger generation like Gen Z and even millennials don't even know how to date, how to relate to each other, how to have relationships anymore. And the girls that I talk to are very brainwashed. They don't know why they believe what it is that they believe about women and men and these sort of things, why they have this strong, independent woman mindset. But if you look at the pop stars, the movie stars, every single major female figure in media these days is hypersexualized, is, pushing the strong, independent, sexually liberated woman narrative, the I don't need a man narrative. And there's a reason for that. I mean, you can't engineer society if you have intact families where men have a vested interest in protecting their wife and their children. And what we've seen is that this was a very effective campaign to kind of remove fathers from the home and replace them with the state. If you look at out of wedlock births and you look at welfare spending in the United States and you plot them on a graph from 1960 to now, they go up almost completely in lockstep with one another. So I think that it's just shattered the underpinnings of what holds society together.
It's a base, like the most base form of divide and conquer, isn't it? You divide inside the home you get between man and woman, and it takes away from romance and all of that, because you can't be like soppy about a strong woman. Often you'll get told to man up and stop being the romantic or the person who wants to do good for your wife, or the person who cares about your wife and your family. Is true. It feels like that we've been separated, we've been pulled apart, and everything. Whenever I read literature from the past, I always feel like we're missing something. That something's been taken away. Something's purposely been taken away, and I think that's what you described there. Now, you're clearly doing important work, and you're talking about a lot of stuff that a lot of people, including a lot of feminists, are very worried. And I've spoken to a lot of feminists behind the scenes. I know I'm just a man. I'm just a man in the world.
How dare you?
How dare I possibly speak to women to try and understand what's really going on? But I do kind of like understand what's happening. And I try and take it from a perspective where I have I give everything a pinch of salt anyway, because people are unique and individual anyway. But you're doing a lot of stuff, and your work, you've got, and it's a highly rated book, Occult Feminism: The Secret History of Women's Liberation. It's definitely on my list of must reads. What made you start writing such a vital work?
Well, it kind of started for me when I was 20 years old and I had my first baby. Everybody around me from the time I was little said, you're going to go to college and you're going to have a career, especially because I was in a lot of gifted programs. And by the time I finished high school, in public school, I realized that school was not about education. It was not for smart people. It was not there to make you smarter. It was largely kind of an indoctrination camp where they condition you to behave in a certain way, which I didn't want to continue doing. So I didn't go to university. I had a full scholarship. I declined it. And I had my first child when I was 20, and everybody thought my life was over. And I remember everyone around me just telling me, you got to go to work. The baby will get used to being in daycare. You'll get used to being away from her. This is how you have to do things. This is how we do it now. And I kind of looked around myself and I went, this is crazy. I'm going to this job. I'm going to pay half of what I make to some other lady for her to raise my child most of the day, which is what I want to be doing. And even the Christian conservative women around me think this is fine and normal. And I just thought it was incredibly unnatural, very inefficient, and bizarre. So that was kind of when I started thinking about these things. And then over the course of homeschooling my own children, which I ended up having 5, I'm a big history fan, just like you are. And I kind of, these questions are in my head and I start looking into it. I start reading about women's liberation movements and I thought it would be about the funding, the book. I thought it would be about the progressive industrial elites who funded it and pushed it, and the CIA. And it is, there's a lot of that in the book. But there was also this connection I could not ignore to Luciferianism, occult religion, very anti-Christian sentiments all throughout even the earliest feminists, going back to Mary Wollstonecraft. And Steinem agrees with this. Steinem said that Christianity was the number one thing standing in the way of women's liberation. And so did Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said this in 1895 when she wrote The Woman's Bible with a couple dozen other feminist radicals of her time. So I couldn't ignore this thread of anti-Christian sentiment that ran through, and people's beliefs are what pushed them to do something like this. So I wanted to understand their worldview, their religious beliefs, their philosophical beliefs. And that's in large part what the book is about as well. It's a worldview kind of spiritual war, essentially.
We're talking feminism, deep, dark feminism, though. We're talking about the darker side at the moment. And of course, I was mentioning your book, Rachel, Occult Feminism: The Secret History of Women's Liberation. And now, with a history of demon worship, spirit mediums, witchcraft, CIA spies, and sex cults, does the feminist movement today still have significant trust issues?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you go now to TikTok and just search the hashtag witch talk, you will find the hundreds of thousands of videos of young women who have melded this like radical feminist mindset with new age occultic witchcraft type of spiritual beliefs. And it's more like neo-witchcraft, like Wiccan paganism, this return to Mother Earth stuff, which was huge in the 70s, and it was very, very much a part of radical feminism in the 70s. But this stuff is extremely popular now, and they talk about things like ritualizing your abortion, which definitely Gloria Steinem had a huge part in this sort of thing, of making abortion a sacred religious right rather than just some sort of, Enlightenment individual right idea. So even now, this is very much what it's entwined with, and it is, it's a natural fit if you think about it. So if you're a young girl growing up in the West, and maybe you had Christian parents who gave you rules that you didn't like, and you go to college and you're going through your rebellious period and you get really into women's liberation, women are still very spiritual beings and they want some type of religious belief. But obviously Christianity isn't going to fit because it's very patriarchal. They don't have any goddess worship elements or anything in Christianity. So they find paganism, earth worship, some kind of mixture of Buddhism, tantric, Hindu, any kind of blend of this stuff, similar to Theosophy. And you get this goddess empowerment ethos going. You get this female empowerment stuff. And it's just as alive and well today as it was in the 70s and even before that. It's actually one of the fastest growing religions in the West, is like the Wicca, witchcraft, paganism stuff.
I've experienced this firsthand in a previous relationship. I experienced someone actually suddenly moving in, a woman who is basically said she was a sorceress and was able to take over someone's brain, really, and make them believe a lot of things, because people are primed, especially women. They seem primed to accept this sort of stuff because they're not given options elsewhere, because the options have been taken away elsewhere, it seems. It must be really interesting researching these books, researching a book like this. What were some of the most intriguing facts that you picked up along the way?
Oh, I would say the Margaret Sanger chapter was the hardest on me to write. I had nightmares while writing that chapter and doing deep dives into Sanger and her life and her beliefs. First of all, she was a complete fraudster, which is another thing we see like all through the book. A lot of these women who were pushed to the front of the feminist movements, even going all the way back to Victoria Woodhull in the middle 1800s. These women were snake oil salesmen. They were propagandists. They would just wholesale lie. Another thing that Steinem also kind of made up a lot of things and had a lot of unfalsifiable big tales that she would use to promote propaganda. But Sanger, I mean, as the founder of Planned Parenthood and completely funded by the Rockefellers, she was, hanging out with some of the big occultists of her day, some of the more crazy folks like Havelock Ellis, who had a lot of very bizarre ideas about sexual liberation. And Sanger's husband took like her punishment for her when she got caught doing criminal things. He went to jail on her behalf, and she just left him. She abandoned her children. One of her children actually died in someone else's care because she would just leave her children with whoever so she could escape the police, travel around Europe, having, open relationships with a lot of the prominent men of the time, including H.G. Wells and some others. So just reading about her life and how much of the propaganda she put out, which was so influential. I mean, the phrase back alley abortions comes from her, and fake statistics that she put out that she knew were false. About how many, illegal abortions were happening through the years that she was trying to get it legalized prior to Roe v. Wade. So, I mean, the woman was a total scam artist. Her own biographers admit this. It's not just my opinion. But the things that she would propagate, she was part of this idea of telling women that your husbands are the primary threat to your safety, that your husband is the primary danger to you. And I've been on the whatever podcast lately talking to young ladies, and this man versus bear question comes up. It's all over online right now. If you had to be stuck in the woods with a random man or a random bear, who would you choose? And an astonishing amount of young ladies say the bear. They think the bear is safer. So I have a piece on my Substack I wrote, which goes over 45 years of data from the National Incidence Study, proving that your married husband, the husband you are married to and having children with, actually poses the least threat of any man to you. And it goes over all this data proving this, but the average woman doesn't believe that. She thinks it's safer to cohabitate with a boyfriend, which is statistically 12 times riskier as far as any form of abuse goes than being married. But we just convinced women that marriage to a man is the most dangerous thing, and that if you marry a man, he's going to become abusive, he's going to become controlling, you'll have to depend on him, and that this is inherently dangerous. And Sanger was really instrumental in pushing this propaganda early on, and it's stuck around even 75 years later. People still believe this.
That's amazing. It is truly amazing that I'm a bit empathic. I go around being caring, trying to be caring at least, trying my best. And I know there's a lot of men like that, and you tend to get into a long-term relationship and marriage because you love somebody else. I've never really understood where this all seems like a way to destabilize and to separate the things that give you that stability, separate you from the things that, and it just seems like such an obvious push. So how has your work been received by established feminists, or are they still continuing to use their usual trick of ignoring anything which doesn't promote their curated narratives?
They mostly ignore it. I will occasionally get some who want to do debates with me, and I always do. It doesn't usually go very well for them, but but occasionally they still want to do debates on this topic. But mostly they ignore it. I've had a few that have tried to go through the source material in my book and, with the intention to debunk me, and it hasn't happened yet, because what they do is find out that my source material is the writings of these feminists themselves. I go right straight to their own writings. Most of them were writers, or at least kept journals, but most of them were propagandists, so they did a lot of writing. They wrote articles, periodicals, journals. A lot of them did debates back in the suffrage days as well. So it's not hard to learn about what they believed or why they were promoting this stuff. So I simply tell you about that in a way that you're not going to hear from the mainstream media, but it's definitely not what people think. And there's lots more shocking stuff in the book. It really blew my mind that I haven't seen anyone else talk about this sort of stuff, about what these women were up to and who was paying to send them around traveling and speaking, who funded their newspapers and things like this. So there's a lot to discuss.
It sounds like with people like, if you're hanging around with people like H.G. Wells and you're hanging around with Fabians, and they've got a whole a whole ideology there that's not going to be positive for your family life, that's for sure. And Marie Lowe in the chat says, I can't stop laughing about the bear. Are these girls stupid? But unfortunately, it's not like you're stupid if if some part of your logic has been taken away from you, or you've been denied some training in some part of your brain, when we know that how to train people logically and how to get people's rational mind thinking. So although there are gatekeepers aplenty who are pushing what Camille Paglia may have once termed a Betty Crocker style of feminism, who are the current heroines on the feminist scene, do you think?
That's kind of a tough one, because it's almost everybody. Like, to me, Taylor Swift would be a huge feminist icon, and you might not think so because she's not an academic, right? But if you've seen footage of her concerts and what happens to the girls who are these major Taylor Swift fans and they go to one of her concerts, it's like religious hysteria. There are girls crying, breaking down, screaming, like absolutely having a mental breakdown, kind of like what we saw with the Beatles and some of these other, like Elvis, where the girls just absolutely lose it at these concerts. And my friend Jamie Hanshaw, who's also an author, she does live talks about this, and she has a whole presentation on the ritual elements of Taylor Swift concerts and how they are filled with witchcraft and Luciferian elements. And these 10, 12, 14-year-old girls are her biggest fans. And she's 34, she's unmarried, she's not a mother, almost all her songs are about, the jerk she just dumped, right? And she even has a song kind of making fun of herself, saying, I'm the problem, it's me. But these kind of pop icons, these cultural icons, Kim Kardashian would be another one, Beyonce would maybe be another one. This is who young girls look up to. And you can't grow up as a young girl in the West and not be influenced by it, because these women have millions of followers on every platform. They saturate the culture. If you walk into a grocery store, you're going to hear a Taylor Swift song, right? So she kind of pushes this strong, independent woman. I don't need a man, sexually liberated. I can just burn through boyfriends and into my mid-30s be this single, childless, rich, influential woman. And young girls think this is what I should be. This is what I need to be. And if Taylor doesn't need a husband, neither do I, that sort of thing. So I feel like the most prominent feminists of today are these like mega pop stars, these movie stars, social media influencers. Almost all of them push the strong, independent woman narrative and this idea that men are the enemy, men are just there to try to control you and keep you down because they only want one thing, that sort of thing.